Apparently, there was a decade when people had the internet but didn't really know how to use it. And supposedly, in that same decade, most people watched sitcoms on television in prime time because that was the only time to see them. Writer Chuck Klosterman details this strange bygone era in his latest offering. It's called The 90s, a book. And he joins us now from Portland, Oregon for more. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
All right, so we're seeing references to the 90s in movies like Captain Marvel and TV shows like Yellow Jackets and Pam and Tommy. Why do the 90s appear to be having a moment right now in pop culture?
Well, that's a very interesting question because typically interest in the recent past tends to go in these 20-year increments. Like in the United States in the 1970s, there was a high interest in the 1950s, like with Happy Days and American Graffiti and Laverne and Shirley and Grease. In the 80s, there was a intense sort of rediscovery of the 60s through like the Big Chill, Family Ties, this idea that sort of maybe this revolution that they had believed had happened had failed and they had to sort of reconcile that. In the 1990s, there was interest in the 70s. Musically, with like the rediscovery of classic rock, the movie Dazed and Confused, the most obvious example being That 70s Show. So it seems as though this obsession with the 90s should have really happened more in the previous decade, or maybe, just our recent past. But it seems as though now we're almost in this period of a perpetual now, where the 90s don't just seem like the last decade of the 20th century, but maybe the last decade that will be framed the way that we traditionally think of the framework of decades. And this interest in the 90s might be last a little longer. It won't be as much the trend, but more so a thing that seems real connected to what's happening now, even though some of the events feel weirdly distant.
We're going to get into the pop culture, politics, and technology of that era, but I'm curious, what interested you in writing a book about the 90s in the first place?
Well, I had a book come out almost 20 years ago called Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs that was a very personal collection of essays. So it was sort of how the 90s meant to me as a person. Like it was things that I was interested in, things that I experienced, and that was sort of the main criteria. I'm a little older now, and I kind of wanted to do a book again about this period, but I wanted to do it sort of with a little bit more objectivity and a little more detachment. I probably wasn't ready to write this kind of book when I was 28 or whatever, 29. So I thought, well, now maybe I'm finally at a point where I can do a book where I can attempt something that was certainly more complicated than the other 11 books I had done, which were just sort of extensions of myself.
Now, before we delve into sort of the topics you talk about, I kind of want to make sure we get an idea of when the 90s officially began. Because for some people, that's January 1st, 1990. It ends December 31st, 1999. You think a little differently. When exactly did the 90s officially begin and end?
Well, I mean, officially, your description is right. If we only go by calendars, but culture and time doesn't really use the calendar. Nobody rips, the December off their calendar and it's like, well, my life is different now. I'm a different person. Like, it tends to be the texture of the period. Now, the kind of conventional take has become that the 90s really begin when the Berlin Wall falls in late '89. And then it ends at 9/11, and that this is sort of the way we sort of understand this period of time. I alter that slightly. I do use 9/11 as the endpoint, but my sense is that after the Berlin Wall fell, well, there were big global implications. At least in North America, the year 1990 was pretty much just an extension of the 80s. A lot of the things that we associate with 80s culture were still central to the life, the day-to-day life of a person in the year 1990. I start the 90s with the release of Nirvana's Nevermind in fall of 1991, because that to me is when the texture and the caricature, maybe the cliche idea we have of the 90s really starts. The things that we associate with that time period sort of emerge from the shift in the popular culture that happened when this idea of sort of what grunge in general, but specifically Kurt Cobain and Nirvana wanted to represent. Not necessarily what they did represent, but what their desire to represent was, which was this idea of what had once been seen as the counterculture now becoming the mainstream culture. That the biggest band in the world, or perhaps like the biggest film in terms of critical interest, what was happening in television, what was happening in politics and sports, things that had once been sort of seen as an element of the kind of the underground was now kind of pushed to the front, and that kind of created this, I don't know, this dissonance between how somebody who experienced that culture is supposed to feel about something that they had once sort of viewed as an extension of their alienation, but now was actually what everybody liked. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about grunge music. A lot of people associate, obviously, the 90s with that scene. How influential was that scene to pulp culture? You talk about Nirvana and Nevermind in 1991 as well.
Well, as a musical culture, it was to a degree derivative. It was very much like a lot of what had happened in the middle part of the 1970s, sort of updated through kind of the idea of a lot of like punk ideologies from the 80s. But in a non-musical sense, it was extremely significant. It had this sort of rippling effect through culture where a belief came that if you wanted to understand what a young person thought like or felt like or what they wanted from any kind of product, musical or otherwise, you had to understand like someone like what did Kurt Cobain seem to want? What were his values? There was this idea that a lot of the things about rock music in particular that had always been desirable and really central to the youth experience were now a little bit embarrassing. I mean, the grunge bands, as huge as they were, always felt almost oppressed by the fame that they had achieved and in many cases pursued. And this is where you start seeing these things that we really associate with, like in some ways, like the baseline of if you were making a situation comedy about the 90s, what would you want the characters to think and feel like? A lot of these things would come out of this idea that success, and particularly like a commercial kind of success, was an embarrassment and something that you wanted to distance yourself from. There's a section in this book where I discuss how if you talk to a young person today, say somebody who's really politically engaged and pretty intelligent young person, and say, what is the biggest problem in North America? They would likely say capitalism. Whereas if you had found that same kind of person in 1995, they would have much more likely said commercialism. It wasn't that the idea of the structure was the problem. It was how things were packaged within it. There was this belief that things did have merit, but we damaged that by trying to sell it in a way that didn't sort of have an organic appeal to its audience. And these are things that you can really connect to the grunge movement.
Now, grunge and hip hop music were sort of ascending around the same time, but grunge didn't seem to last too much, or not past 1999. What happened there?
Well, I mean, what you're seeing in there is that it was the ascension of hip hop is in some ways the musical story of the 90s in terms of if we're looking at it through the lens of right now. If we're looking at what was influential about the culture we're currently in, it was sort of this idea that hip hop had moved from this sort of fringe thing to kind of incrementally become like the dominant form of youth music. What you see with grunge is the recession of rock from the center of culture. I think some people assume that when I say that, what I'm saying is like rock music is over or it's dead or whatever. That's not what I'm arguing. As a genre, it will always exist in the same way jazz will always exist. But what we see with grunge is sort of what happened at the end of the jazz period, where this thing that was once the center of the culture sort of became this thing that was ancillary. And with grunge music, what you see are these artists who were incredibly self-aware about the meaning of what they were doing. They had looked at bands from the 80s, say some of those like hair metal bands on the Sunset Strip, or even the indie rock scene from that period, sort of the MTVing of music culture. And they saw that as something that was probably detrimental to them as artists. And they injected that into their art. And it was this self-awareness, this understanding of what grunge was while it was happening, that sort of robbed it of its power over time. And, with all art, what seems to happen is a high degree of self-awareness by the performer is what ultimately sort of makes it less meaningful to the consumer.
All right, I want to talk about Generation X. This was a generation that came of age during the 90s. What was so distinct about this generation?
Well, the generational question is always tough because if you look at Generation Z or millennials, or Gen X people, even almost any young demographic, something that is sort of emerging and is new, and there's an understanding that there's a new kind of person in their 20s. Many of the qualities are kind of applied to all of these groups because they're really just applied to young adults. This idea that maybe they have less interest in making money, or they have less interest in home ownership. Maybe they're more skeptical about relationships. They're trying to detach from whatever was the previous dominant generation. And all these things were true about Generation X. What is interesting about this generation, though, is that when these qualities were applied, it seemed to be happening really in the present tense, that it wasn't something that we were retroactively looking at and saying, okay, this is what this period meant. People who were, in their 20s, in their early 30s, in the 90s, were sort of given these messages while they were supposedly experiencing these events. And the thing that is probably most significant is they oddly accepted these ideas. I mean, the normal inclination when someone tells you you're like this because you were born in this year is to push back against it.
Right.
To say like, well, how can that be? It's like astrology. Just because I happen to be born in the early 1970s doesn't mean I'm this specific kind of adult in the 90s. But with Generation X, there tended to be a willingness to be like, well, okay, fine. And this was seen sort of as like an apathetic, almost validation of the idea that they would say a Gen X person was uninterested and apathetic to the world at large, and then they would say like, well, okay, well, you can say that about us, that's fine. It seemed to prove the assumption. A lot of the things about Generation X did end up becoming true simply because the demographic itself didn't disagree with it.
Very interesting. I want to actually segue to this concept that you talk about called, selling out, because you write a lot about it, and the concept of selling out and the degree to which that notion altered the meaning and perception of almost everything is the single most 90s aspect of the 90s. What did it mean to sell out?
Well, okay, so you look at entertainment in the 1980s, or just culture at large in the 1980s. There was a real reward for the aspirant person. The idea sort of was like, this is a time when you can become as big as you have the potential to be. And so it was the idea of selling out in the 80s had been this thing. It's like, well, you're kind of just doing what everyone is doing. It's very similar to how it is now. If you try to talk to a young person and describe what selling out means, it's confusing. It doesn't make any sense. It seems like you're almost saying this idea that you're not supposed to try to succeed. It seems completely antithetical to any kind of commercial enterprise. But in the 90s, this idea of selling out really peaked. It had been the idea had been around for a long time, but we reached this point where it wasn't just the idea that what you were doing was an attempt, or like kind of a craven attempt to make money. It had to do with the desire to be liked by people who weren't like you. And this was very discomforting to a certain kind of artist because it seemed to damage the integrity of what you were doing. The 90s had this relationship with integrity and authenticity that was very complicated for people who were trying to do anything interesting during that time. I mean, because it was essentially saying this idea that you understand to be ludicrous, because you also had to understand it was kind of ridiculous to try to be, any kind of public figure and have no success. But you also had to accept the idea that sort of playing your cards too openly, or showing this kind of desire to get attention and be loved, was kind of a pathetic impulse. There were a lot of ideologies from punk music that had come through in a lot of different ways. Independent film was like this to a degree. That if you, the idea was to make a film that completely sort of, projected the idea of the filmmaker onto the screen, almost as if the idea of the audience was secondary. Because to think about the audience was to sort of admit that you weren't so much a creator of art, but a creator of a commodity. Just the idea of things being commodified as it applied to the creative process is really intertwined with this period. Now, why this happened, it's hard to fully understand because we don't really have that relationship to these things anymore, but we did at that time. A movie like Reality Bites, for example, really only makes sense the year it comes out in 1994. 10 years earlier or 10 years later, the whole idea of that film seems to kind of contradict what would be a sensible relationship for young people to have about the world, you know?
Well, let's actually talk about that. So we actually have a clip of Reality Bites. Obviously, a romantic comedy, came out in 1994. We got Ethan Hawke, Winona Ryder. For those who haven't seen it, this clip, a little bit of a content warning. The scene contains some strong language. So let's roll that.
What is it that you want from me, huh? What is it? You want me to get a job on the line for the next 20 years? Until I'm granted leave with my gold-plated watch and my balls full of tumors because I surrendered the one thing that means shit to me? Well, honey, you can just exhale because it's not going to happen, not in this lifetime.
All right, fine. You don't want to work, fine. Don't
Lady!
You want to be in a band, then be in a goddamn band. Rehearse every day, play 3 times a night. Don't just dick around in the same coffee house for 5 years. Don't dick around with her or with me. I mean, try something for once in your life. Do something about it, but you know what? You better do it now, and you better do it fast, because the world doesn't owe you any favors. And whether you know it or not, you're on the inside track to Loserville, USA. Just like him.
Passionate scene there. What does the film say about Generation X and the idea of selling out?
Yeah, I write a lot about Reality Bites, and I have in the past, and it's not because of its cinematic value as much as sort of its kind of its ideological value. For people who have no relationship to this film, it's centered around a love triangle, the way many films from this period are if they're romantic comedies. You have the Winona Ryder character, and she has sort of two guys who are pursuing her. One is the Ethan Hawke character, which we see in there. He's almost like, like the platonic ideal of what slacker culture was. He's just completely encapsulates almost every sort of broad generalization about what a certain kind of guy was like during that period. The other guy who pursues her, who's not in that clip, but directed the film, was Ben Stiller, who plays this person from essentially a kind of a fake version of Much Music or MTV, who's like trying to convince Winona Ryder to take her documentary film and make it into this more commercial product. Now, the reason this is interesting is because at the end of the film, she ends up going with Ethan Hawke, even though he treats her pretty poorly, is sort of a bad boyfriend in almost every possible way, whereas Ben Stiller just wanted to help her and sort of support her, but he was a conscious sellout. The Ben Stiller character was somebody who looked at entertainment as a way to sort of make money and achieve success, whereas the Ethan Hawke character sort of represents the opposite. Now, when this film came out and she ends up, choosing who she chooses, you would see a lot of reactions from older critics at the time that, like, well, Winona Ryder picked the wrong person. She picked the guy who's a jerk, but he's the authentic jerk, as opposed to sort of the compromised individual who actually cared about her. Now, when I saw that film as a senior in college, me and all my friends assumed that perception just showed the difference between an older person and a younger person. A younger person saw this relationship as romantic and intense. An older person saw it as doomed. But what time has sort of shown is that when new generations experience this film, they sort of share the opinion of what had been, I guess, for lack of a better term, the baby boomer idea. They were like, why would she end up with this guy who's doesn't seem to care about her, who seems more interested in himself than her? As it turns out, the strangeness of this relationship is not connected to the difference between like youth and age. It was just that period. Only in the middle 90s did the idea of being with an authentic jerk seem more desirable than somebody who was likable, but willing to sort of give up who he was, compromise his identity for these other things. And this is why you watch that film now, and you might not think it's great entertainment, but it's incredibly telling because it happened at the time. It isn't something where we went back and we tried to make a movie to explain this. This is a movie that explains the middle 90s as it was occurring. And that's very rare for a period piece to sort of have that degree of self-awareness. Yeah.
Very interesting. I want to shift gears a little bit. Want to ask you about the internet. It was a big thing. Well, maybe not back then, but I'm curious, people probably didn't know how basic the internet was back then. How did people at the time view it?
Well, so we all understand that the internet essentially does have its foundation in the 90s. And in fact, it's very easy to imagine, say, a time 50 years from now when people think of the 90s and the only thing they really think about is the inception of the internet. But the internet was completely different during this period, which is something that we've almost collectively forgot. The internet kind of overwrites itself. So the things that we think about the internet are really, for the most part, if you asked any of your viewers, like, what's good and bad about the internet, they would give this whole list, and we would almost, even though we might disagree on certain points, generally that list would be pretty static. But they would all be extensions of social media, which didn't exist in the 90s. Those are 2000s concepts, the 21st century concepts. The idea of the internet in the 90s was almost like this unknown potentiality. I mean, we think of this period as having a real kind of sort of cynical, sort of underwhelmed view, but that wasn't true in the insular world of the internet, where it was believed that it could kind of transform anything. And so our understanding of what the internet was in practical terms in the 90s tends to be inaccurate. We think of the 90s almost operating in an internet way the way it did now. It was just the mechanics of it. We were like building the blocks of this. So when you think about what the internet meant to the 90s, what you're seeing is something that actually affected culture less than it seems in retrospect, despite being almost certainly the most important thing that came out of this time.
I want to talk about the impact that the internet had on the music industry. I remember in the early 2000s, I'm sitting at my desktop downloading stuff off LimeWire. Obviously in 1999, we have Napster. How did it reinvent the music industry?
Well, the music industry is a very easy way to understand how things like the internet affect things that have seemingly no relationship or no natural relationship to network computing. Okay, so like, things like Napster, that was just a mechanism for listening to music. It had no impact on the creation of music, the direction of music, but it really changed people's relationship to the value of music. I mean, when you look through, say, World War II up until, the late 90s, music forced kind of physical subcultures to exist simply because of scarcity. Like, very few people had the ability, especially if they were young, to buy every record they want or every cassette they want. So they ended up buying things that sort of tied them to a sect of culture. They would say, I like Rush, so I'm going to buy Triumph. And it's pretty soon they build this sort of collection of music that has some kind of ideological similarities. You saw this with goth culture. You see this with dance culture. Then we get to this time when songs now are free and unlimited. So the person who once maybe could only have 15 cassettes in their whole collection could now have 15,000 songs on their hard drive. That gave them a lot more agency, right? It would seem as though that was better. But the thing that it shifted was the idea that this music had sort of its own separate value. It'd be the idea, I draw a similarity to, like, counterfeiting money. If you counterfeit a bunch of money, it doesn't give you more money. It incrementally changes the value of all the other currency. And that's sort of what this easy access to music did. It changed the way people thought about music. It didn't make people like music less, but it made it seem less tied to themselves because we removed that sort of physical object that for a lot of people was the non-musical importance. The idea that they were had a relationship to something that really reflected who they were. That if you went into their house and you looked at their record collection, you could get a sense of what this person was like, maybe. Might not be totally accurate, but you could have a vague idea of what they were like. You can't really do that by looking at someone's download history because it's all free. And it means that they're sort of picking things arbitrarily. I mean, you don't want to think about music purely as a commodity, but the commodification of music did sort of create a lot of its meaning, and that was destroyed by the internet.
All right, I want to shift gears and talk politics, and I want to specifically talk about the man who came from a place called Hope. I'm talking obviously about Bill Clinton here. You somehow tied in Bill Clinton and his time at the White House with the movie American Beauty, which came out in 1999. In what ways are these two things related?
Well, so at least in the United States, I mean, Clinton is the defining character of the 90s. I mean, in some ways, I guess Kurt Cobain is the image that we may immediately imagine, but because Clinton was president for 8 of the 10 years, if we're using the calendar, and had such sort of a sweeping effect on not just the not just politics, but sort of the way young people came to understand politics. He's this, incredibly important figure whose legacy now has strangely almost been a little bit deteriorated by the way culture has changed over time, which is not how it usually happens for people who leave office. Their reputation tends to rise. His has not. The reason I compare it to American Beauty is because this was a film that came out in 1999, was commercially successful, dominated the Oscars, dominated almost all the awards, was seen sort of as this film that was addressing these kind of existential problems that were happening in the suburban United States and suburban Canada and probably Europe as well, where there was this idea that maybe people had achieved the things that they desired to achieve, and yet found them sort of unsatisfying and unfulfilling. What has changed is that the reputation of that movie is now terrible. I mean, it's like it is actually seen not as just a movie that maybe wasn't as good as we thought, but problematic and sort of an extension of privilege. And that all the problems that Kevin Spacey, the main character in that film, has are actually things that a modern person almost can't even relate to. He gives up this great job at a magazine to work in a fast food restaurant, to sit in his garage and smoke pot all day, and has this weird relationship with his wife and is interested in his daughter's friendship, a friend of hers. All of these things seem like the problems of people who would have supported Bill Clinton in a way. And at least in the United States, the idea that those problems can be taken seriously is kind of over. You see a movie like American Beauty, and you see people struggling with issues that no longer warrant the classification as issues. And and it was interesting because Clinton liked this movie. Like Clinton gave an interview to Roger Ebert and talked about why he liked American Beauty, and it makes so much sense when we think about that in retrospect. And yet both have sort of suffered the same fate. The culture changed, and it completely obliterated all the things that we originally liked about these identities when they came out. Like the things people praised American Beauty for and the things that Bill Clinton was praised for at the time are the exact same things now used to sort of mitigate their importance.
I got about 30 seconds left, Chuck, and I want to ask you, when can we expect a book about the 2000s?
Well, there are two answers to this. One is that, wait 15 years, it'll happen because it always does. But another part of me wonders if that's true, because the difference from the way culture has sort of moved, the idea of sort of encapsulating, say, 2000 to 2010 as a differentiation from 2010 to 2020 is almost purely political. From a lifestyle perspective, it doesn't seem like things are evolving in this way. There's a theory called the slow cancellation of the future by a guy named Mark Fisher, who's dead now. But I fear that is what's happening. I'm not even sure why I fear it. It might be fine, but there may not be a book like this about the time that, we just experienced. I mean, but I've been wrong before, and I'll probably be wrong again.
Chuck, I really appreciate you taking the time. Really great stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.